The Minnesota Wild have had no shortage of first-round picks through their franchise history. Some good, some not so good, and some the jury is still out. We'll take a look at that history of first-round draft picks on today's episode of Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we dive into the Minnesota Wild's history of first-round draft picks to determine which hit, which missed, and which the jury is still out on. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. If this is your first time listening to Locked On Wild, we're glad to have you along for the ride and hope that you stick with us through the rest of the offseason into next year as well. If you are an everydayer who tunes into the show each and every day of the week, we are so glad to have you back and thank you for your continued support. As I said to start off the show, the Wild have had no shortage of first-round picks through their franchise history since they came into the league as an expansion team for the 2000 season. And some of those have been successes, some have not. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through and just look at those picks and see how many panned out and how many didn't. Now, we're going to go up to 2015 because at that point, we're still in kind of jury's out mode on those players yet beyond that. And so we'll talk about it a little bit at the end, but we're going to mainly focus on now to 2015, 2000 to 2015, because a majority of those players have either been in the NHL solidly at this point or have finished up their careers. And so let's start off with the 2000s. First draft for the Minnesota Wild. They started things with a bang as they draft Marian Gaborik with the third overall pick in the 2000 NHL draft. Gaborik, all told, had 1,035 games played at the NHL level, 407 goals, 408 assists, 815 total points, and Gaborik here is a resounding hit. Now, Gaborik's career is going to always be one of those what-ifs because if he could have stayed healthy, there is no telling what his career could have looked like, considering the numbers he did put up despite the games missed, especially in the back end of his career. He was a star player with the Minnesota Wild. He helped elevate this franchise through their first few years of existence with that improbable run to the Western Conference Finals in 2003. And he helped just kind of put Minnesota on the map as a savvy goal scorer, an exciting player to watch. Anytime you watch Minnesota Wild hockey, he was the guy that you were tuning in to see. So obviously, resounding success for the Marian Gaborik pick there in 2000. Interesting to see the shift in styles between what we got with Gaborik, who was obviously a prolific goal scorer, dynamic point producer. You go then to 2001, in which the Minnesota Wild selected Mikko Koivu with the 6th overall pick in the 2001 NHL draft. 1,035 games for Koivu all told, 206 goals, 505 assists, 711 total points in those 1,035 games. Now, my stance on Mikko Koivu is not meant as slander, but this has been my stance from the beginning, is that Mikko Koivu, had he been put in a 2C role, I think his career would have looked a lot differently than people look on it now, because he was thrust into that 1C role and just wasn't that guy. He was a dynamic defensive center, but the offense just did not translate nearly as well as the defense did. And you think about putting a guy like that in a position that's not that go-to top guy. Now, he won faceoffs, yes. He had the great shootout move. And so ultimately this pick was a successful one as well, but it is kind of indicative of what has become a on-again, off-again problem for this franchise through their history, is that you just have not had, for the majority of the Wild's tenure, you just have not had that definite guy on that top line in that 1C spot. Koivu, a 2C. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But still successful. He played 1,000 career games at the NHL level. He was a consummate professional here. Longevity, you name it, he had it. Very durable. And so still a successful pick for the Minnesota Wild with that 2001 selection. 2002, we go to Pierre-Marc Bouchard. Bouchard finished his career with 593 games, 110 goals, 246 assists, 356 total points in those 593 games. Some memorable postseason goals for Pierre-Marc Bouchard, always thought of as kind of a go-getter center. And so, if we look at what constitutes success, obviously there are several names on this list that have not gotten to even that number of games, even close to that number of games. And so I'm going to put Bouchard in the solid selection category. 593 games, a ton, but it still, if you look at what, and not even necessarily what they did in Minnesota, just what they did in their careers in general, because there are a number of different ways that the back end stuff can play out depending on how this goes or how this goes. And so I'm going to put Pierre-Marc Bouchard in the solid selection category. Obviously, emphatic hit is one thing, solid selection is another, and then yikes is going to be the other category. So Bouchard, solid selection there in 2002. 2003, Minnesota Wild select defenseman Brent Burns with the 20th pick in the first round. And Burns still at it, 1,333 games, 245 goals, 593 assists, 838 total points. And Burns, we know how things played out with his Wild tenure. Was traded and has just turned into one of the more prolific offensive defensemen in the NHL. And so his selection, while at the time there were some thoughts about maybe transitioning him away from defense, playing him in more of a forward role to try to maximize those offensive capabilities, ultimately he stuck as a defenseman. But still, a very lengthy career, very prolific career. Spent a lot of it with the Sharks, and San Jose has won some, but not a lot recently. And so I'm going to put Burns in the hit category because, again, it's the longevity that we look for here, and to be still playing here in 2023, 20 years after he was first drafted by the Minnesota Wild, that's got to count for something. Now, 2004. Oh boy. I'm sure a lot of you remember this selection, mainly because of the fact that it's going to be a short bio that I read. AJ Thielen, defenseman, was selected with the 12th overall pick in the 2004 NHL draft. Yeah, he didn't make it to the NHL level. And so this is a resounding yikes at this spot, because if you look at how that draft played out, with the Wild selecting Thielen with the 12th overall pick, well, let's look at a couple of the games, or a couple of the names that went a little bit later than he ended up going. Now, it's not a huge list because a lot of these guys are at this point out of the league, But Devin Dubnyk went 14th that year to the Edmonton Oilers. And beyond that, there were a lot of guys that didn't have a ton of prolonged success, but to have none it's not a great sign for the selection overall. So that's a yikes for me for the A.J. Thielen pick in 2004. The Wilds redeemed themselves by selecting Benoit Pouliot with the 4th overall pick in the 2005 draft. But if we look at how things played out in 2005, who was taken directly behind Benoit Pouliot? Carey Price. And Carey Price has become an incredibly decorated goalie throughout the NHL. Mostly has gone to a couple of different stops, but mostly the Montreal Canadiens. Actually, I take that back. I'm thinking of Marc-Andre Fleury for some reason. Benoit Pouliot, then Carey Price, who's been with the Montreal Canadiens, and has been one of the fixture goalies in the NHL for quite some time. So that one, I suppose you could say solid pick for Pouliot, considering he played 625 career games, had 130 goals, 133 assists. Point numbers not great in those 625 games, but yeah, that's always going to be one of those what ifs. Had they just taken Carey Price as opposed to Benoit Pouliot there at 2005. So 2000 through 2005, we have 3 hits in Gaborik, Koivu, and Burns. We've got solid selection for Pierre-Marc Bouchard and for Benoit Pouliot, and then a yikes for A.J. Thielen. So they did hit on 3 of those picks. 2 others were solid. 1 was bad, but just wait, because those numbers are going to equal out before we get too far into this. So we'll turn our attention now to 2006 to 2010 as we continue to look at the history of first-round picks for the Minnesota Wild on today's episode of Locked On Wild. Take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-unders to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on Major League Baseball than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official betting partner of Major League Baseball. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, tune in as we finish off the week by taking a look at some of the other notable picks for the Minnesota Wild throughout their draft history. In later rounds, other than the first round, we'll find gems in the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh as well. That's coming up on tomorrow's episode. For those everydayers, you can hear it right here on your favorite podcast platform. So continuing to move our way through first round draft picks for the Minnesota Wild at a glance. We got through 2005, moving on to 2006. James Sheppard selected by the Wild with the 9th overall pick in the 2006 NHL draft. Sheppard played in 394 total games, 23 goals, 68 assists, 91 total points. Boy, that's not great. And so I'm going to put this one in the yikes category. And it's obvious here. You look at the names taken at the top of this list. Jordan Staal, 2nd. Jonathan Taves, 3rd. Phil Kessel, 5th. And even looking a little further down the list for the Wild, it seems like just could not get high enough on this list to get some of those guys near the top. And you look down all the way towards 22 and 23 before we find anybody else who really had success from this first round. Claude Giroux at 22, Semyon Varlamov at 23, and then Nick Foligno at 28. So not a class that had a ton of overall success, but just a situation where the Wild missed out on some of those guys at the top of the list. Kyle Okposo at 7 as well. But still, that production, 23 total goals in 394 games, that's going to be a yikes for me for that pick in 2006. Moving on to 2007, Colton Gillies in the with the 16th overall pick in the 2007 draft. Winger played 154 total games, 6 goals, 12 assists, 18 total points in those 154 total games. And if you want me to make you feel worse, well, let's look at how things played out the rest of the way. So Gillies taken at 16. Ian Cole, defenseman, taken by the St. Louis Blues at 18. Max Pacioretty taken by the Montreal Canadiens at 22nd. And right above Gillies, Kevin Shattenkirk goes to the Avs. Riley McDonough goes to the Canadiens. Logan Couture also in this draft, courtesy of the San Jose Sharks. And so this is a yikes as well. And so we start this portion of the mid-2000s with 2 yikeses back to back. Just not panning out, and it doesn't get any better from here. So 2006, 2007, and 2008, all yikeses, because Minnesota Wild in 2008 with the 23rd overall pick in the first round, they take Tyler Cuma, a defenseman who got to the NHL for 1 game, which featured 2 penalty minutes. And just before Cuma was taken, Jordan Eberle goes to the Oilers. John Carlson, defenseman for the Capitals, goes 4 picks later at 27. And beyond that, most of the success at the top of this draft: Steven Stamkos, Drew Doughty, Alex Pietrangelo, Josh Bailey, Erik Karlsson at 15 to the Senators. And so just another situation where it didn't pan out. It's going to be a yikes for me for the 3rd consecutive season. Does it get any better in 2009? Well, kind of. Nick Leddy, the pick for the Minnesota Wild at 16th overall in the 2009 draft. Leddy, all told, played in 929 total games, 70 goals, 313 assists, 383 total points for Leddy so far throughout his NHL career. Chris Kreider taken 3 picks after Leddy. Kyle Palmieri also taken further down in this draft. Marcus Johansson drafted in the first round of this draft class at 24th overall. And a few players above Leddy, Dmitry Kulikov, one of those guys. Again, a lot of success at the top of this draft. And Leddy has been a solid player. I mean, 900 total games so far in his career. That's nothing to be disappointed about. And so I'm going to say solid selection for the Minnesota Wild here at 16 in 2009, which breaks that trend of yikeses for the middle portion of the 2000s. We'll finish with 2010. And in 2010, with the 9th overall pick, the Minnesota Wild select center Mikael Granlund with their pick. And here's how the rest of that draft played out. After Granlund was taken at 9, Jack Campbell, goalie, taken by the Dallas Stars at 11. Cam Fowler taken by the Anaheim Ducks at 12. And you look at some of the centers taken: Tyler Seguin at 2, Ryan Johansson at 4, Jeff Skinner at 7. Vladimir Tarasenko drafted 16th overall in that 2010 first round. Kevin Hayes and Evgeny Kuznetsov, and Brock Nelson also taken. Also, Charlie Coyle selected 28th by the San Jose Sharks in that first round. So again, Granlund's a solid player, has been, but again was just miscast in the role that the Wild chose to throw him into after drafting him. So I'm going to say solid selection by the Wild there in 2010, getting Granlund. 750 total games so far, 145 goals, 339 assists. Again, solid, not a hit, but still solid. And that ends what was a mostly yikes middle portion of the Minnesota Wild's draft history. In the first round, you had 3 yikeses in a row, and then a couple of hits to round it out. Let's see if they can finish on a high note as we finish off the 2000 to 2015 first round picks. We'll take a look at the rest and see how things played out. Spoiler alert, went much better. We'll continue that as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure you tune in as we highlight some draft gems for the Minnesota Wild throughout their tenure in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds to see where they have been able to find some absolute gems throughout the rest of the draft. You can find that right here on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe if you have not already so you don't miss out on any new content from us at Locked on Wild. So finishing off, I'll look at first round history for the Minnesota Wild. And the Wild in 2011 had 2 first round picks. Started off with the 10th overall pick, Minnesota Wild selecting defenseman Jonas Brodin. We know how that played out. And it's interesting here because you look at how many players above where Brodin was taken have achieved all-star status. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Gabriel Landeskog, Jonathan Huberdeau, Mika Zibanejad, Mark Scheifele, Sean Couturier, Dougie Hamilton, all getting there. Brodin, as of yet, has not, but boy, has he been a solid player for the Minnesota Wild ever since. And you look at how things have played out in the rest of this first round. There are some names here, but not a lot that have had a ton of success. Jamie Oleksiak, still in the league. JT Miller with the Vancouver Canucks, of course. But down the line, it's been a struggle for the rest of the guys, other than Rickard Rakell at 30th overall, who did get to the All-Star game as well. But some other names have been solid. Philip Deneau becoming part of the mix with the Los Angeles Kings. And so I am going to call this a hit for the Minnesota Wild because Brodin has been one of the best defensemen, one of the most underrated defensemen in the NHL, and just continues to be just an absolute lockdown defender for the Wild. So that was a hit to start things off here in our final few years of selections. The Wilds go right from there. Oh, and numbers, of course. 741 games and counting for Brodin, 47 goals, 166 assists, 213 total points, just 228 PIMs in those 741 games. Then the Wild select with the 28th pick in the 2011 first round, Zach Phillips. And Phillips, this was a pick that was acquired from the San Jose Sharks. Phillips never got to the NHL level. So this is a yikes. Brodin is a hit. So that kind of balances things out a little bit. We moved to 2012. This year, the Minnesota Wild selected Matt Dumba with the 7th overall pick in the 2012 draft. Right after Hampus Lindholm was taken. Some other names that were taken below him include Philip Forsberg, Tom Wilson, Tomas Hertl, Andrei Vasilevsky drafted this year at 19th overall. But beyond that, players that have had some success at the NHL level, but not a ton. And so I'm going to say solid selection here for Dumba. Dumba's played in 598 games, 79 goals, 157 assists, 236 total points. And Dumba, especially early in his career before the fight that just turned him into a completely different player, Dumba was a pretty solid offensive defenseman. But once he lost that ability offensively to contribute, his game changed, and he just became a little bit of a liability out there defensively. And so, solid selection for the Wild there in 2012, but I'm not going to put Dumba in the hit category based off of everything that I just discussed. No first-round pick in 2013. Just going to gloss right over that. 2014, the Minnesota Wild selecting Alex Tuch at 18th overall. Tuch so far has played in 379 career games, 109 goals, 147 assists, 256 total points in those 379 total games. We know what happened with Alex Tuch. He was sent to the Vegas Golden Knights in the expansion draft to protect Mr. Matt Dumba. And for Tuch, who was taken at 18th. Kevin Fiala drafted that year at 11th by the Predators. Dylan Larkin drafted just a couple of picks ahead of Tuch. Then we see David Pastrnak drafted at 25th by the Bruins. Adrian Kempe drafted 29th by the Kings. And so players that have had success, there are players on this list that are starting to find some success at the NHL level. Obviously, at the top, you've got Sam Reinhart, Leon Draisaitl, Sam Bennett, all very, very solid players. William Nylander with the Maple Leafs, another solid player as well. So there are a lot of good names in this draft class. And for Alex Tuch, he's a solid player. He's a bit on the injury-prone side. And so I'll say solid selection here at 2014. Because we saw a little bit of the Tuch experience. The one that really gets me is in 2014, the third round selection by the Wild, in which they make a trade with the Tampa Bay Lightning, who jump up to take Brayden Point. The Wild draft Louis Belpedio. And Brayden Point has like 400 goals in the NHL since. He has been just an absurdly good player for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and the Wild just for whatever reason did not have him on their list. Okay, I was a little off. He has 218 career NHL goals, but he still is in just under 500 games. He has 463 points. He came off of just a 51 goal season this past year. Outrageously good player, and the Wild had Louis Belpedio on their list as opposed to Point. I'm not bitter, but I'm also very bitter. So we'll say solid selection for Alex Tuch. The final pick that we'll look at is the 2015 first round, and the Minnesota Wild at 20th overall selecting Joel Eriksson, center from Sweden. 421 games for Eriksson so far, 92 goals, 114 assists, 206 total points for Eriksson so far in his NHL career. Other picks in this first round, Matt Barzal went 16th, Kyle Connor 17th, and Thomas Chabot went 18th. Even Evgeny Svechnikov went just before Eriksson. Ilya Samsonov 22nd, Brock Besser 23rd, Travis Konechny 24th, Anthony Beauvillier 28th in this draft. And so a lot of talent here, especially this being the Connor McDavid, Jack Eichel draft, where they went 1-2, then Mitch Marner went 4. I'm going to say hit, because I just think what we've seen with Joel Eriksson so far in his NHL career is a guy who just shows the ability to get better every single season that he's in the league. And keep in mind, it took him a while to get his footing at the NHL level. It took him a couple of full seasons before he started to really put things together and he just has improved like clockwork ever since. So I'm going hit for the Joel Eriksson Ek pick in 2015 to finish things off. And so as we see, the Minnesota Wild started off as they were getting going with some hits. They had some rough draft years in the middle, and they finished it off very strong in those teen years of the 2000s. It's also easy, super easy for us after the fact to look back at these picks and say, yeah, that worked, that didn't. It's harder to do so in the moment. But hope you enjoyed this look at first rounds past for the Minnesota Wild here on today's episode of Locked On Wild. If this is, again, your first time tuning in, make sure that you take the time to subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our content throughout the rest of the offseason into next season as well. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.